Hello and welcome to this special edition of Straight Talk. I'm Ayşe Süberker. Arming one terrorist group to fight another. That's been the U.S. policy in Syria for the past several years. Starting in 2015, the U.S. armed and trained the YPG to fight Daesh, despite knowing it had links to the PKK terror group. The Turkish government criticized the move from the start and warned of consequences that are playing out today in northern Syria under Operation Peace Spring. And after initially declaring his indifference, President Trump switched between defending his abandonment of the YPG and the withdrawal of U.S. troops in northern Syria to imposing sanctions on Turkey. So how did we get here? How did these two NATO allies drift so far apart? Adel Halim has this report.
Turkey's stated goal in Syria is clear: eliminate the security threat posed by the YPG terror group along its border, and in the process, create a 30-kilometer-wide safe zone. Back in 2012, the YPG took over the area from the Syrian regime and has held on ever since. Now remember that the US and Turkey are NATO allies, but for a long time, America's strategic partner in the fight against Daesh has been the YPG, the Syrian branch of the PKK terror group based across the border in Turkey.
And when President Obama took the PKK, when they bring in PKK, that's a tough deal because that's been a mortal enemy of Turkey. So when you bring them into a partnership, it's a tough situation.
A tough situation because Turkey has been fighting the PKK and YPG for decades. Referring to the PKK and YPG as Kurds, Trump also had this to say.
We have spent tremendous amounts of money on helping the Kurds in terms of ammunition, in terms of weapons, in terms of money, in terms of pay. With all of that being said, we like the Kurds. Now you have different factions in there. Again, you have PKK, that's a different faction, and they worked with us. It's a rough group, but they worked with us.
Washington insists the YPG is a separate group, a position Turkey flatly rejects. From 2016, here's an exchange between the U.S. Defense Secretary at the time, Ash Carter, and Senator Lindsey Graham.
Is the PKK a terrorist organization in the eyes of the Turkish government?
The PKK is a terrorist organization not only in the eyes of the Turkish government, but in the eyes of the U.S. government as well, Senator.
Is it surprising to you that the Turks may be upset with us by arming the YPG in Syria, since they're so closely aligned with the PKK?
No, it's not. No, it's not at all, Senator.
Today, though, Senator Graham is actually leading the charge for sanctions against Turkey. The U.S. has maintained that its relationship with the YPG is temporary and tactical, but Ankara strongly opposes this arrangement.
Batı ve Amerika hep birlikte söyledikleri şu: siz Kürtleri öldürüyorsunuz. Kürtler bizim kardeşimizdir. Bizim bu mücadelemiz Kürtlerle değil, bu mücadelemiz bizim terör örgütleridir. Ve PYD, YPG, DAEŞ, bunların hepsi birer terör örgütüdür.
The alliances and the abbreviations don't end there. The YPG forms the backbone of the US-backed Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF.
They formally called themselves the YPG, who the Turks would say equated to the PKK. You're dealing with a terrorist enemy of mine. How can you do that, ally? So we literally played back to them, hey, you got to change your brand. What do you want to call yourself besides the YPG? And with about a day's notice, they declared that they were the Syrian Democratic Forces.
Turkey says its stated goals in Syria are clear, but Ankara will tell any and all that it struggles to decode the statements and actions of longtime allies like the United States. Adel Halim, Straight Talk.
And joining me now is Vehbi Baysan, who is an assistant professor at Ibn Haldun University, and Sean Michael Cox, a professor at Bahçeşehir University, who specializes in U.S. foreign policy. And joining us from London is Adam Gary. He is a political analyst specializing in Eurasia and the Middle East. Gentlemen, welcome to Straight Talk. It's good to have you here. In the midst of shifting alliances and loyalties, extremely fast-paced developments are taking place, especially after Turkey started its Peace Spring operation. In our panel today, we're going to break down the political and military ramifications of this operation and also repercussions it created around the world. But I want to start with you first. Vehbi, could you tell us about the latest on the ground, and has the Turkish armed forces achieved what they have targeted so far?
Well, actually, it started all of a sudden, although it was expected, and for months Turkey was voicing their concern about what's going on in northern Syria, and that they would take action. So within a few days, they took control of certain areas, especially, I think we should identify, I'm sure our viewers would know the map, but it is M4 motorway, which links Aleppo all the way in Iraq to Mosul. So if you think it goes parallel to Turkish border, yes, and sometimes just curves to 30 to 35 kilometers. So Turkey is saying that we need to establish a security zone in this area. There are two areas that reach to that region. So Turkey's operation actually goes from that area. One is from Akçakale down to Ain Isa and to Raqqa, that's road leading there and bypassing M4. Other one is from Ceylanpınar, Aziziye and El Menenje, so it goes to Haseka. Now, the reason I'm telling you this, because these are the hot spots where we have armed men. Now, Turkey for long voiced their concern because in the pretext of fight against ISIS, up to 80,000 men armed, financed, trained, and gain field experience. Yes. So that is a serious threat to national security of Turkey, which in my opinion, actually anybody's border, if you have 80,000 armed men, that is a problem.
Okay. So the operation is going as it is planned.
Okay.
Yes. So Sean, we've seen an incredible criticism towards Turkey's border security operation. Why do you think the US and many European allies chose to side with the terror organization YPG instead of a NATO ally, Turkey?
Well, part of the reason is because of the incoherent policies that the Europeans and the North Americans, especially the United States, have implemented in Syria. Ideally, they would like to partner with what they consider to be a reliable national and sovereign entity like the government of Turkey. But there's a lot of animosity between the Turkish government, the US government, the Turkish government, and different European governments. And Ankara is not seen as a really reliable ally to these Western powers, and their intentions in northeastern Syria in particular are not seen as being honorable, at least from the foreign policy generating parts of these governments.
But such kind of condemnation was never seen before. I mean, both for the Euphrates Shield and the Olive Branch, those two operations Turkey launched. What makes this operation so contentious? I mean, those areas were liberated and about 400,000 Syrian refugees were able to return to their homes. So why is this so contentious?
Well, there are several things coming into play here. One is the sheer scope of this operation, although I think ultimately it will probably be a lot smaller than we're led to believe it's going to be. These others were seen as very targeted events, where this is seen as much more wide scale. If you're saying we're going to secure our entire border 30 kilometers deep into the country, that seems to be a massive operation.
So that's 480 kilometers long.
Yes, so 480 kilometers long. So it seems to be a lot more substantial. But you also have domestic politics coming into play in a number of different countries as well, with elections coming up and whatnot.
Yeah, we're going to talk about the US aspect. So these criticisms have also added to this misinformation against Turkey's operation. I mean, some international media outlets even broadcast some video games, like it's as if it's a Syrian bombing. So I want to go to London to talk to Adam. Tell me what has led us to this misinformation that somehow Turkey's Operation Peace Spring will provide a fertile ground for the terror organization Daesh, and it will endanger all the gains made in the last couple of years.
Well, the falsehoods come from one of two places. either one is witnessing the phenomenon of politicians in Western countries not understanding their own history and their own security interests, or something worse. We could be seeing devious politicians who expect that the people are stupid enough to believe the myth. The idea that Turkey is somehow a rogue state, which is the clear implication of this, what I frankly call an ultra-liberal to far-left narrative, is simply absurd. Turkey is one of the only functioning democracies in its region. It's got a robust economy, which I think in the long term has a very good prospect ahead. It's a country that has been a loyal and very productive NATO member since 1952, round about the beginning of the NATO alliance. And since then, Turkey has always taken a very responsible position against all forms of terrorism, whether it's religious extremists like the Gulanis or the Daesh, whether it's communist extremists like the PKK-YPG. And the idea that Turkey is somehow doing something against Western interests when it's the PKK themselves responsible for bringing drugs and the crime associated with it into Europe is just utter nonsense. It's as though there's this atmosphere in certain parts of the West where they've let the far left rewrite the last 30 to 40 years of history. One sees it very much in 21st century narratives about the 1980s struggle against communism in Afghanistan. Now many people, even those who supposedly are on the right, even though I question whether that's an accurate description of them, are somehow saying that what Ronald Reagan did in the 1980s in crushing communism in Afghanistan was somehow bad. Now, Turkey has long been a stalwart anti-communistic ally, and the communist PKK terror organization is something that all responsible nations ought to fight together.
And it's interesting that U.S. chooses to ally with it. Okay, thank you, Adam. You touched on a very important point. It seems that the world has forgotten Turkey since, 2005. Turkey has been a part of this international coalition against Daesh. And one of the countries who suffered the most from both Daesh and the PKK terrorism. I would like to remind our viewers about the attacks which took place on Turkish soil. So Daesh attacks from 2013 to 2019 have killed 315 people. Some of the most high-profile attacks include the 2015 Ankara bombing that killed 109, the Istanbul airport attack in 2016 that killed 45 people, and a 2017 Reyna nightclub attack, which left 39 people dead. And when it comes to the PKK, their attacks from 1984 to 2019 has killed around 40,000 people. So European countries are so worried about this operation. They're actually panicking, so to speak. Vehbi, I want to ask this to you. Is this because Turkey pledged, after securing these terror areas, to bring the Daesh fighters before justice, try them, and send them back to their home countries?
Well, President Trump many times said this, that European countries are actually not accepting those Daesh-related people, although they are, their citizens. So they just turn a blind eye to it and just ignore it. They think that this problem is going to go away. So someone has to deal with it. That's the problem. U.S. was dealing.
And now it's not.
And it's not. And Aisha, let me tell you, they had a huge camp there. The most probably dangerous terrorists were kept and only left in the hands of PYG people.
Yes.
There was no even an international security for these people. So, once Turkish operations started, PYG just opened the doors and let all these people
we're gonna
out. Now,
touch on that.
Now, what is
going
to happen is, I think, very serious.
From a European perspective, we see France is quite happy that some of its citizens suspected of being a Daesh fighter, they're very okay if they are tried in Iraq and get executed, maybe. So could you tell us about the European perspective in this point? Are they really concerned that one day these citizens will be sent back to the countries?
Well, obviously, it's not just European countries, but also in North America as well. When you send you have someone who's been radicalized, gone abroad, fought for a number of years for an ideology that's fundamentally against the values of your country, you don't want those people returning. Recently, for example, John Walker Lind, the so-called American Taliban, was released from prison after the time he had spent there after getting captured in Afghanistan, and he still remains radicalized. People are very concerned about him re-entering society in the United States. The same thing for France, for England, for Germany. Fighters from those countries that have gone and lived for years under very harsh conditions, doing unimaginable atrocities, coming back to home. Even if they get rehabilitated in prison, are they truly rehabilitated? That's the question.
That's the question, but that needs to be sorted out sooner or later, right? So, Adam, I want to get back to you. Could you tell us about the general sentiment in Europe? We know that the European Union countries preferred to remain kind of inactive throughout this process, and do you think they do regret it now?
Well, the European countries have always been a third-rate player in the Syria conflict from the very beginning. This is due to a combination of lack of organization, lack of will, and a lack of cohesive policy. They know that they don't like Daesh, because no one does, but they don't really know what to do about it. And so whilst you've had serious disagreements at times with the more proactive countries that are involved in the Syria conflict, Europe has been paralyzed with this kind of indecision, which only gets more, frankly, embarrassing as time goes on. Frankly, the PKK, after Turkey, stands to harm Europe more than, for example, the faraway United States. And because of that, one would have thought and one would have hoped that this could be a chance for the European Union to at least show political support for what Turkey's doing. Instead, they're doing this awkward virtue signaling to a PKK, YPG terror organization that has brought harm to Europe through the drug trade, through the gun running trade, through the horrible things that they have infamously done to young children. And so it's frankly astonishing that the EU has taken a line that is in favor of a terrorist organization rather than a NATO member, rather than a country that trades freely with the European Union in most goods. Turkey is a partner of Europe, and it should be treated like one. Turkey's been a partner of multiple nations on all sides of Europe ever since the age of Ataturk, and it's very saddening to see Europe go back to this 19th century great game mentality. It doesn't serve any purpose at all.
All right. Now, news have been circulating on various platforms that Daesh fighters were set free by the Turkish armed forces and the Syrian National Army, but we have reports and some credible evidence that it was actually the YPG who set them free. Let's listen to what Turkish Defense Minister Hulusi Akar said about the situation in one of these prisons, then we'll continue to talk.
Regarding the Daesh prisoners, we are determined to do everything we can. However, there is only one Daesh prison in our region, and when we went there, we saw the prison had been evacuated by the YPG and that the Daesh prisoners had escaped. We have determined this with photographs and films. We have negotiated with American counterparts on this issue, and we will continue to negotiate.
So, Vehbi, who will be held responsible for freeing these fighters, and what will these fighters do?
Well, let me say this first. I think it was around 35 to 40 kilometers away from Turkish border. So, in a couple of days, Turkish army did not reach there. So it is really like, fabricated, saying that Turks did it. Because when they arrived, there are films proving that all the prisoners were already out. But the problem there is that these are the children and wives of these terrorists actually actively fighting. Let's put that, it's very important to underline this. And number two, the ones captured were actually real killers. And now they just simply melted away and disappeared. And most probably they will be reunited with these groups. And then the real fight will begin. Therefore, I think we should really emphasize this here, that it is vital that the European EU countries come for help to Turkey. So we should all be fighting the terrorism, because one day the terror will reach in their capitals and cities.
It has already. Adam, I want to turn to you. We have also been witnessing some head-spinning developments on the ground after years of fight against the regime, the YPG, abandoned by the United States, decided to ally with the Syrian army. So how significant is this?
Well, it's significant in terms of what it might mean on the ground, but it's not significant in the sense that it was entirely predictable. This group would ally with literally anyone if they thought in their perverse estimation that this could help them achieve their goals of illegally carving out a statelet in the territory of at least 3 to 4 other nations, because we have to remember groups that are affiliated to the PKK in Syria, Turkey, Iran, and Iraq all have this same illegal secessionist goal, and they seek to achieve their means through supreme brutality combined with a incredibly extreme far-left ideology. So once the United States left, the leadership of the terrorist organization obviously looked to see, well, who else can we make a bargain with? Now, Assad doesn't claim to want to give them their own statelet or even autonomy in the northeastern part of Syria, but practically his hands are tied because he has virtually no presence in that part of Syria. So they're clearly going to try to make some sort of bargain with him. But I predict that too will end in tears, probably for both sides.
And nowadays, most of the U.S. senators are staunchly against Turkey's operation and support for more sanctions on Turkey. But there is one senator, Rand Paul. He actually understands Turkey's concerns and brings some clarity to the situation on the ground. Let's listen to him, and then we'll continue to talk on U.S. policies.
And interestingly, I think the irony of this whole thing is everybody's worried about the Kurds and the demise of the Kurds. The irony may be that when the Kurds finally become aligned with Assad, which seems to be happening in the last 24 hours, that it may be their best chance for actually having a semi-autonomous region of Syria that is Kurdish. It's what happened in Iraq and which I hope will happen in Syria, but it's not going to happen unless the Turks actually feel comfortable with Syria controlling their own sovereignty and not allowing incursions from Syria into Turkey. And I think that's what Turkey's most worried about.
Well, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan just said the Assad regime entering Manbij is not a very negative development because it's their lands after all, but it is important the YPG doesn't remain there, he says. So how viable option that the Kurds will have a semi-autonomous region in northern Syria, Vehbi?
Well, if you look at the agreement they made, which I clearly read it more than once, you can see that the YPG or in general whoever negotiated no match to Syrian regime. So we should underline that first. Second, they see it's their territory, it's the legitimate land for Syrian government. It seems they're going to take over. And if you look at the discussions at Damascus, actually they're saying it's better that the Turks take place there and protect the area, because Turks are not trying to hog the land or even establish any independent, whatever you call federal structure there. So when you look at it, there are two interests are actually matching. And we have this at Afrin. You remember Afrin was taken by, or rather, with the help of Turkish authorities, taken by the regime, and then they handed it to Turks to take care of it. Turkey established local administration. Actually, the members were the locals as well. So that's very important for us. So Turkey is not there to fight against Kurds or even clean the area from Kurds. Turkey, their confusion.
As long as there's no terror threat, Turkey is okay with it?
Well, absolutely. It's not against Kurds. It's YPG. YPG is not everywhere representing Kurds. That's I think the world should.
You can see in Iraq the relationship between the Kurdistan Regional Government and Turkey is quite good. The Turkish military has trained Peshmerga fighters there as well. They have good relationships, good trade relationships. I think what everyone would like to see here is a similar type of thing in Syria.
So the U.S. actually has lost a lot of ground to Assad regime. So how is this in interest of the U.S. policies with this?
Again, U.S. policy has been so inconsistent that they seem to just be attracted to the flashpoints, not to anything that's really long term. This has been latched onto because we're entering an election cycle. The Democrats have grabbed hold of it because this is perceived as a weakness that Trump did, a big mistake that they can take into the election cycle. Republicans are responding to it because they don't want to be seen weak by potential voters, and also to support the military who has been committed to working with the Kurds in northeastern Syria.
I'm afraid we're out of time, gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining me on Straight Talk. Appreciate it a lot. And Adam, thank you for joining us from London.
Thank you. Thank you.
And that's all for this edition of Straight Talk with me, Ayşe Süberker. If you've got any comments, do share them with us on Twitter with the hashtag Straight Talk. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Until next time, take care and goodbye.